Librarian. I am proud to welcome Catie Marron here to Harry Bennett. Catie's book, Becoming a Gardener, What Reading and Digging Taught Me About Living, brings her experience of creating her first garden with her study of great garden literature to better understand how becoming a gardener can enrich one's life. In addition to creating and editing 2 anthologies on the value and significance, it is.
We can't hear it.
Okay. Catie has created and edited 2 anthologies on the value and significance of urban public spaces. She's a trustee and chair emeritus of the New York Public Library, where she was chairman of the board. So she's a friend of libraries everywhere. I'd like to thank her for coming, and I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ferguson Library for sponsoring tonight's talk, and Elm Street Books for coming to sell books. And we will have a Q&A afterwards. You can use the microphone here if you're in person, or type in your questions in the chat in the Zoom. Thank you and welcome to Catie.
Thank you all very, very much for being here. We were just reminiscing because I was at Ferguson, the main branch, 6 years ago. And in fact, a driver drove me here and I gave him the address, but also Ferguson Library. And we accidentally went there. And I felt very comfortable, but of course, here we are here, and both buildings are so beautiful. And I really am admiring all the flowering trees to get from one place to the other. So that's a pleasure. Since you're all here, my guess is that many of you are gardeners, and others, right?
Of course.
Okay. Others, like I was until a couple of years ago, might be armchair gardeners, or others might well be just curious and not yet ready to take the plunge. My guess is, though, since you are living in these great surroundings, is that you all have a strong bent towards nature. And I hope this talk and the book will be interesting to you all. My book, Becoming a Gardener, What Reading and Living Taught Me About. What reading and digging taught me about living is about my quest to become a gardener, and even more to try to understand what gardens and gardening can mean to people and why they have such a deep, meaningful impact. As the subtitle says, I've done it through reading and learning from great writers and gardens, and that's often writers who write on other topics entirely, but they have a garden and somehow they feel very compelled to write about it. And also through making my own garden, which is that, from scratch. The inspiration to do this really came through various ways, but I'd say 2 in particular. And one, just some. Oh, sure. Is that better? Is that better?
Yeah.
Huh? Is it not?
It is on.
Okay.
It's just,
Oh.
it only goes to a certain level over here.
Oh, here. Okay.
It's on, yeah.
One idea came, which I'd say is more practical, and one is more philosophical. And the philosophical one, I think you'll all particularly like being here. It comes from a quote I heard about 10 years ago, which was said by Cicero about 2,000 years ago. And that quote is, if you have a garden and a library, you have all you need.
Yeah.
This, by the way, is just a photo I took of the Appia, and it certainly looks like it could have been there 2,000 years ago. I've pondered Cicero's quote ever since I first heard it. And to this day, I don't completely understand what he means, but he's clearly getting to the essential importance of gardens. Perhaps he talks about our connection to nature and attempt to create a friendship with it, or as one writer, Penelope Lively, wrote, our primeval need to be outside. As I've loved gardens my entire life, I really wanted to understand what he meant. The practical came a few years later, after our family bought a new house in Connecticut, in the very back country of Greenwich, halfway between the villages of Bedford and Greenwich. We were just talking about that. And we didn't have that when I was here 6 years ago. And furthermore, I should add that in all the writers in America, and I have a lot more that are in England, which makes sense, but virtually all of those in America live in Connecticut. And it truly, there is something about Connecticut. Anyway, as background, we have had a wonderful house in Southampton for more than 30 years. And as I love gardens, about a dozen years ago, I asked the well-known landscape designer Miranda Brooks to create a garden for us. This is the garden behind the house. There it is again. And there. So, I really admired what she was doing, and I secretly wanted to be her apprentice to learn how, but didn't do it. We came upon our new house in Connecticut, I'd say by happenstance. We'd often talked about having a house big enough for us and future generations, and a place that would be easily accessible, where we could all gather. This house, show you, did that. And the ceiling was definitely high enough for my husband and son, both 6'6". I think it's a handsome house. It was designed specifically for a lovely family who lived in it for over 20 years and then sold it to us. And we definitely made it our own. For instance, the gray shingles were dark brown when we moved in. But somehow, and people thought it looked like us, but somehow I honestly felt like I was living in their house. I didn't feel comfortable with that feeling at all. I've tried various things to change this. I met with the architect to hear what was his vision. I got sage, which I'd never done before in my life, waved it around doors and windows, but somehow this really very uncomfortable feeling continued. So one day I was walking our dog, and I suddenly thought, if I rooted myself to the land, which is what really drew us to the house, which you'll see in a second. And one more picture of the house, by the way. That's early on, right before we moved in, because you can see there's no planting there whatsoever. But I thought, okay, if I root myself to the house, or root myself to the land, maybe that would root me to the house. And that is not when I had the chance to make a garden. I set out with a plan for an 18-month project, 6 months to design the garden, and then 12 months to watch a full year's plant cycle. I have been collecting gardening books for more than 20 years, and every so often I actually try to read them. I read Russell Page's The Education of the Gardener on several Memorial Day weekends. I think that was because of its title, but it somehow never led me to action thinking. But as I love looking at the books, I decided, now that I was going to create a garden, that I would turn to them for help. And I read so many. I took masses of notes and wrote down enough quotes to fill a book. I've woven what I think is the best of their wisdom and advice into the story. And through the writers, I learned how gardens are really very rich in life's lessons. And the similarities between the garden and life are striking. This I find, there you go. I find particularly amazing. That is our garden on the right over there in August, but that's a Klimt painting, as you would know. And I happened to see that painting a few months after we took that photo. And I don't think if you wanted to make something copy the other, you could do any better than that. In short order, I read from various writers that gardens give you enduring happiness and joy. Sorry, to show you this picture because I think that is very joyful. They offer hope. I think that does too. They teach patience and tranquility, and they provide sanctuary and beauty. I also realized that there's no test to make me, prove that I become a gardener. In fact, no one was going to test me at all. And this word, being a gardener, can mean something very different to different people. Jamaica Kincaid, the writer, summarized my feeling when she wrote at the beginning of her book, aptly called My Garden Book. She said, I started to plant things. This is not the same thing as being a gardener. My husband gave me some packets of seeds, along with a rake, a hoe, and a digging tool. I went outside, dug up the yard, and put the seeds in the ground. That's a photo by Harold Chopik. I don't know if you know him. He's considered the patron saint of soil to a lot of writers. This is by his brother and illustrates one of his books. The skin of my right forefinger split, the muscles in the back of my calves and thighs were sore, and the digging fork broke. For all that, the seeds did not germinate. Since then, I have become a gardener. And that was exactly my thought. I really don't think that becoming a gardener happens immediately. As you can see, a little seedling popping up. The writer, Elizabeth von Arnim, wrote that no one can garden alone. I believe that's definitely true. Not only did I learn from these wonderful writers, and I came to call them, in fact, my literary mentors, but I learned from two wonderful real-life mentors as well. One, a young landscape designer, Catherine Giovanni. She's there on the left. And she actually was helping Miranda Brooks with our garden, and that's how I got to know her. And Gabe Police, who has a great technical knowledge of plants. Their skills were wonderfully complementary, and we all had a really happy time doing this project together. They both let the thoughts and the decisions be mine, which was, I think, very important for this. And I very much appreciated that. One thing I learned, and anyone will learn early on, I'm sure, that gardening is all about trial and error. And even if you're a top expert, it's always the case. Another thing I think that's quite true is that gardeners are really quite a generous group of people. I have learned a lot from this project. It's really, in looking back, how aware I am of that. And it's been hard to choose what to write about today. But as I talked about Cicero, most of my remarks will really be trying to unearth what he said. But in addition, though, while there's not much practical knowledge here, there's a lot of practical knowledge that I picked up that's throughout the book. I'll start today by telling you a few thoughts to take you through building the garden. The first is to make a garden, you need the power of imagination, the power of memory, and observation. A picture a blank slate. And that's what I had after we dug up this old basketball court and a broken down cutting garden. You can see how broken down that is. And together, they left me with wide open space. And it very clearly dictated the size of the garden, which is 48 by 54 feet. This was exciting to me because I carved out my own space, not one of the previous owners. You can see this is what they had done with the space. And I thought this was a big step forward in making myself feel at home. Now, this is where the essential importance of imagination, which leads to memory, comes into play. I have that right? Yeah. Well, any gardener, beginner to expert, needs to call on her imagination to picture what English mid-20th century journalist Beverly Nicholas calls a place for shaping a little world of your own according to your heart's desire. Many writers encourage us. One wrote that half the answer of garden is the constant exercise of the imagination. When we first arrived at our new property, I was awestruck by the timeless sense of nature. Trees and grass, water and woods. One picture down by a lake. That's another picture. And here's another. And sitting on the old New England stone wall, I really imagined what the land was in colonial times. And I think it's because its simplicity was there. It was just so easy to picture. I have always had a strong pull to New England and decided that in keeping with early American gardens, which were there first and foremost, of course, to provide food, I wanted to create a productive kitchen garden. So that's what I did. And here's a photo of it in early summer when the vegetables begin to ripen. As I began to imagine what the garden could be, all sorts of memories came flooding back. I think if you do this, the same thing will happen. Robin Lane Fox, a well-known Financial Times garden writer, in fact, he's been writing his weekly column for over 50 years, says that flowers and gardens from the past stay with us to the end. And I think that's true. My first memories, my actual very first memories in life, were of trees, and particularly a flowering crabapple outside my bedroom window when I was a very young child. And here's the one in Connecticut, and there's another photo of the tree. And that's our land going down to the lake. I love trees. I climbed in them, I swung in them until going off to college. And I thought that was quite embarrassing to admit until the writer Eleanor Corney, who was in Connecticut, climbed them until, quote, well past the age when it was decent to do so. Her children put an end to it. She captured my feeling completely when she wrote, to climb up, up among the leaves beyond the reach of intervention must be the oldest, most joyous instinct in the world, the next best thing. That's a watercolor. Maybe this is the moment to tell you that throughout the book, you will find watercolors by a firm called All the Way to Paris, which is in fact based in Copenhagen. And I discovered through seeing a Danish cookbook and their amazing watercolors, I tracked them down and they were a joy to work with. In addition, there are beautiful photos, you see them throughout here, by a man named Bill Abranowitz, who is as lovely as they come. He lived about 2 hours away from the house, so he could come relatively easily, particularly during COVID when it was quite quiet. And it was great. We want to capture a plant at just a moment, and he'd be able to do that. But this is a watercolor by All the Way. There are also some paintings throughout, modern paintings on the whole that just somehow pertain. In trees, I was in another world. Yet the first memories of gardens for me came out of books, where the garden is a central character. I did not grow up with a family garden, but just a small tomato patch, so I relied on books. In a world of my own, exactly what a garden is where I went whenever I ducked under the covers and read Frances Hodgins Burnett's Secret Garden. I'm sure most of you have read that. And here is a wonderful image of hers in the book. Quote, and the secret garden bloomed and bloomed, and every morning revealed new miracles. Two images from books, which I'm sure you'll recognize. Our garden played a key role with Peter Rabbit and Madeline, and that is the Luxembourg Gardens. As I became an adult, I fell in love with several gardens, which taught me how much meaning they've had in my life. And I'll single out two, which by is my favorite place in the world. I first visited the Luxembourg Gardens, and there you got the boat basin. When I was 23 on a very cold, sunny December day. And there was something about its classicism and its humanity that honestly moved me to tears, which was unusual for me at that age. I realized then how drawn I was to gardens. And for Luxembourg Gardens being then my favorite place in the worworld, I had made a pilgrimage there whenever I went to Paris, and one time on a short business trip, stopping by on the way to the airport. It was, as I said, my favorite place until I saw the garden Nympha. And as well known as Luxembourg Gardens is, I think Nympha isn't. In fact, most people have never heard of it. Anyone here? Have you heard of it? Yeah, oh, it's amazing. It's a medieval garden, about 2 hours southwest of Rome, and it's been restored continually since the early 20th century. And dreamy, that's a watercolor course, doesn't even begin to describe it. In fact, I have used the word paradise one time in my life, and that is to describe Nympha. It is magical. This is the clear water sort of running through a medieval ruin, interpreted by All the Way. These are two photos. These coming up photos are two of mine. I took 3 Novembers ago on a cold, rainy day. And as you see, flower trees run wild everywhere. Roses climb up walls of medieval ruins. There's a stream with the clearest water I have ever seen. In a small hut by the stream, the writer Giorgio Bassani wrote The Garden of Vinci Contini. And it's a book and a movie that I have seen many times and which has always moved me deeply. I have a lot of Italian blood, and so it was powerful in my research to learn that Nympha is in fact the real world garden for the garden in the movie and the book. And my guess is if you look back, you too can mark various occasions by being in the garden. And one last thought on this, which is like a memory and imagination, you need the power of observation. And I certainly, when I was starting to create this garden, realized I had to look more carefully at the natural world around me. And through that, I realized I was developing keener vision and what Penelope Lively calls gardener's eyes, which she thinks are distinctly superior to others. And certainly having a garden has done for me what English journals Anna Patton says, it hones one's senses. Now, many writers talk about gardens teaching patience. And here you'll see the garden just as we started to plant. And of course, one aspect of patience that applies to everyone is when you plant a seedling, you really cannot rush it because you can't rush nature. And for me, a prime example of patience and testing my patience was the saga of building our fence. Since I very much wanted to establish my footprint as you know, house, I decided it was important to put an original fence, not the split rail one, which was perfectly appropriate, the one that you saw in that broken down cutting board. I'm not going to go into detail, but I will show you a few photos to illustrate the steps we had in getting there. This is a very badly chosen idea of mine to copy a beautiful fence that stretches for acres in Bunny Mellon's farmland in Virginia. And it's perfect in these wide open fields. But in a small garden of 48 to 54 feet, it obviously was not a success. A friend called it a corral fence, and I totally understood what she meant. This right here is a photo of our fence structure now. And I very much like it. Catherine and I looked through many books trying to figure out something. We shared ideas. We had dozens, literally dozens of iterations. She's an architect, and so she takes beautiful drawings. And finally, we got to where it is. And it looks simple, but actually it's not in its design. Now here is the fence after winter, because the metal of raw nails, the man who was making it seeped in through there. You can see it looks like it's been singed by a fire. And so there were two choices. I guess there's a third, which is leaving it, but we weren't going to do that. And you could take it down, which we obviously also weren't going to do, or paint it. And here it is painted. And there, I love the green. I think we got the green right off the bat. And finally, we're happy with it. Winston Churchill has a quote: "Every garden presents innumerable fascinating problems." And this was certainly a problem I did not expect to have, and it definitely tried my patience. Now I'd like to talk about another principle of gardening and aspect of its meaning, which is tranquility. And as you can imagine, I think being in one's own special place in deep conversation with nature brings a gardener a great sense of peace. And that was very true for me after my husband died, suddenly December 2019. While I refer to him and our two children, well now into their 20s, throughout the book, I write about this situation in only one small section. I think it may be best right now to read it. It starts with the sentiment of Claire Leighton, an English artist and writer who moved to Connecticut about 1940. Much of what she writes moves me. This in particular, quote, "There is great healing power in digging. This is so much the case that one is tempted to wonder if any actual electrical power comes up to one from the earth. At any rate, however sulking and rebellious one might be at the start, sensitiveness creeps up the fork into the hands, body, and legs. Finally, the brain surrenders, and one is again at peace in the garden." On a February Saturday, 2 months after my husband died, I went back to Connecticut for the first time. It had been at that point a warm winter, and so I went and sat on the ground and dug in the garden. The soil was soft, so I could really easily push my hands into it. That was a very peaceful and satisfying feeling. And that night, I looked out in the garden from inside. And really, I started thinking about spring that was going to come, and I felt my roots in the house beginning to take form. Now, like plants, everything in the world is temporary. And I smile when I think about a quote by an English poet who says, "We come from the earth, we return to the earth, and in between we garden." That's a lot. Now, moving on to a very happy topic, which is joy, which is what writers celebrate, and I certainly experience. And two examples of that. One is our first harvest, which is totally unexpected. On an early Friday in September 2019. Sorry, that is, that's an all the way photo of the garden in which I just described. Okay. Believe it or not, there was both a full moon and of course, Friday the 13th. And this is a combination, the moon and the 13th, that won't happen for another 30 years. So that whole day, once I realized this, after a couple of potential mishaps, I was very relieved when everyone arrived home safe and sound, particularly my daughter, who's a competitive rider. I went out then to look at the garden, as we had planted our first vegetables just 3 weeks earlier. And I was shocked to find that some had come out ready to harvest. Photos, that's again, all the way did their watercolors sort of out of their heads and built to the photos. And sometimes there are pairings that I just love. That is turnips. We had that evening a delicious salad, various lettuces, radishes, and we also had a delicious puree of turnips. And Gay, you saw earlier, convinced me to plant white turnips. And she was really right, they were delicious. And this is a photo of our harvest table in our breakfast room about a year later. Now, another source of joy is our tulips. And when COVID hit, we immediately bolted to Connecticut and stayed in isolation there for months, like we probably all did here. And we felt very fortunate that we could walk outside safely and walk around. I'm sure you probably also recall how gray and cold that spring was. Really quite dismal. But we had planted tulips, and here's another photo. And we put them in to have them bloom before we planted vegetables. And they came up in such bright colors. We ordered a wide variety, and we separated them only by early, mid, and late bloom. And then what we did was literally we take each per row and we throw all the colors in. So the colors are very haphazard. And it was so fun to do it. And to see this bolt of color, bright, happy color, whenever we walked outside during those COVID months, was really a bolt of joy. So very happy for us. Another picture of tulips. And that's another one. I think these are all Bill's beautiful photos, and that's an amazing photo, I think. It looks almost like an Avalon or whatever. So now dahlias are another favorite flower of mine. For a long time, they were my favorite flower. They weren't popular a long time ago. Now, of course, you know, they're very popular. And I don't want tulips to outstage the dahlias, so I thought I'd take a few photos, show you a few photos of the dahlias. There's one. Another, and there's another. And one thing I learned, a practical hint I learned during my research, is that a good system for planting dahlias and tulips is to plant the tulips in the fall. When they bloom, dig up the bulbs, and at that point, plant the dahlias. And when they bloom in the fall, you dig up the tubers and you plant the tulips. So it's a logical system that seems to work. Now, I also don't want all the way to be outdone by Bill in his glorious photos. So just show you a small essay, what we call a moon essay, which are 3 watercolors of the moon that of theirs that I particularly like. So I could continue on and go on and on. And I think of the writer Marjorie Fish, who said gardening is going on and on. but I'm going to stop and I'm going to sum up with two thoughts. And one is a quote by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The quote is, "Tell me about the garden you're dreaming of, and I will tell you who you are." And last week, a friend was interviewing me for a talk, and she asked me that question, and it made me think. And so it might be a fun exercise for you to do yourselves. And last is the garden's connection to the very all-important emotion. There is Herb. We made Herb. He has a fall shirt, he has a spring shirt, and I think he does signify hope. And my favorite quote on this subject comes from Sir Roy Strong, a classic English eccentric, whose many accomplishments include having been director of the National Portrait Gallery and the Victoria and Albert Museum. He says, quote, "People often ask me, what is the most important thing that I've done with my life? And I reply, quote, to have made a garden. If you also ask me what entrances me most about gardening, the answer could be given in one word, hope. Every winter, we live in hope that spring will come. This or that doesn't do as well one year as last. But the hope is next year it will do better. We plant in hope, we live in hope. What more could anyone ask of life?" And that's, thank you.
Anyone have any questions?
Yeah.
Come up and use the microphone.
I think you can.
I can hear.
I take it from all those beautiful tulips, you don't have deer.
Someone else asked us that, and we do have deer, and it's the oddest thing because you can see the fence is not tall enough that they could jump over it. We do have wire down below to keep the animals that might dig out, but they don't seem to come in. And don't ask me why, because they roam, and we don't have deer fencing. No one does in the area, so I guess it's just lucky. It's very lucky. Yeah, because I know in Long Island we have a lot of deer. Yeah.
I also have a story about geraniums winter over and have some upside down bare root.
Huh.
And after 3 months, one of them bloomed.
Upside down in the window.
Oh,
Wow.
No, so it bloomed. Talk about resurrection.
Love that story. I love geraniums. In Southampton, all our pots are big white geraniums. And it dawned on me this year, you probably don't remember, but there's a red door on that house. I've always wanted a red door. So we painted a red door, and I thought we could put red geraniums outside the house. So I am, in fact, just about to do that. I think next week it will be safe to do that, but I think I can. Do you still have a geranium?
Probably the Sundays.
For it. Any other questions?
Thank you for the talk. It was really wonderful. My question to you is this. I know you were involved with the High Line Park in New York City. Are you doing anything with native plants or encouraging any kind of regrowth of native plants on your property? It looks like there's a lot of lawn, so I know that isn't necessarily indigenous. So
I wish we did not have so much lawn, and it's overwhelming, and yet it would be very overwhelming to try to plan it all out. But in fact, there was one area on the side which you can't see, but as you go down towards the lake, and we put in all native plants this year.
great.
So, yeah, yes. And you know, I'm sure you know there are a couple of good nurseries in Connecticut. Question? Yeah.
Well, not a question, but a suggestion. Since you're a book lover and a dahlia lover,
Right.
if you've never read it, Travels with My Aunt by Graham Greene.
Oh, does that have dahlias in it?
Oh, lots of
Really?
dahlia.
Oh, that's great to know. No, I've never read it. Oh, I love that idea.
I've seen the movie.
But read the book first.
Okay, I'll read the book first. That's a great thought. But yeah, I do love dahlias. Do you like dahlias? You like them more or less after you read them?
We love them, but slugs. Yeah.
I guess we're really somehow lucky, very, very lucky. Yeah, hi.
I want to know if it's only for director or we can every practice. Excuse me?
Sorry.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Excuse me, I want to know if it will be a practice for me to know how to make flowers, to make it good, a very good garden.
Advice, did you say advice? I couldn't-
If you can show us how to make a good garden, yes. A practice.
Take a lot of time.
Yes, to make it.
Uh,
Yes, how to put this flower, to marry with another one in house outside.
There's a wonderful quote by Beverly Nichols too about how, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's in the book that you can't keep the spirit of a gardener out of the house. It comes in through the dirt, it comes in through the flowers, and the way he writes it, it's just so romantic, and I just love the image of it. I think another reason I did vegetable gardening, mainly a kitchen garden, which is mostly vegetables, is it's easier. It's very linear. You build rows, you know, do a vegetable per row. You can read what's on the seed packet. Seed packets are super helpful with detailed information. And it's straightforward. It's a nuisance, a lot of people think, in the sense that, you know, as you saw, the lettuces come up and then there's got dirt again. And so you have to replant. But for me, it was more straightforward. I put together a thought about 5 different types of gardeners. One was scene setters, those people, which is really what I think I would be mostly, which is like how you imagine it and you just picture it sort of in the big scope. And then colorists, which are largely English people, as I think, people who create perennial borders, because they're really dealing with this colorism. And I find that to be the most complicated kind of gardening. And that's something I've come to begin to take. One is plants people who zone in on plants. And in fact, there's a book, there's a water painting in the book by Monet. But he talks about his garden at Giverny. And interestingly, he thinks of himself as a plants person. And then he happened to paint his garden. He did not create the plants, so he could paint them. And I think there's quite a big distinction there. The 4th kind is what I call collectors. And those are people who go far and wide. And we owe it to a lot of explorers in years past who bought and brought plants back. And even some things we think of as native, like the apple tree, for instance, or lot, are actually not native at all. And the last one is dirt gardening. And that is what I am trying to be, which is the person who digs in the ground and actually does the work. So I think that's the best way to learn. And you know, somebody said to me, a head gardener of a famous English garden called Graveside, he said, the best way to learn to garden is to find a gardener and watch that person do what they're doing. So it's exactly what you're asking, and is to have that person be out there, you know, whoever that is. And you can go to the nursery and watch whoever, you know, it is in the nursery. It doesn't have to be someone you actually know, but I thought that was your advice.
Do you have a greenhouse?
No.
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 Where do you start your plants? Do you start them in the ground?
In the garage. No. We have light box,
Oh,
but no greenhouse. No. I'm not ready by history.
so next year.
Yeah, exactly. But you know, I'm sure you've seen them. There are really small greenhouses out there, like these rolling greenhouses you can buy that are like a closet. And you just buy them and assemble them. So it doesn't, not like you have to tackle it all.
What's your plan for your next garden?
My plan is to continue this one because it was so intense to try to write and deal with COVID and everything and create the garden And I actually asked myself several times throughout doing this, was I a gardener? And I, for a long time, thought I wasn't. And then finally it sort of clicked to me that actually I sort of was. And B, I didn't enjoy it as much as I could have because there was just so much to do. And now I find I'm enjoying it more. And it's just, I'm, really looking forward to going there this evening. I'm there with my daughter tonight. And just being there and walking the garden. So I'm right now sort of really enjoying the fruits of my labor.
What's growing in your garden right now?
Tulips. But they'll come out, they're almost done. We're on the late and they're still pretty, but they're going to come out soon and then we'll be putting in the vegetables. And as you saw that photo with the Clint, we did put in a lot of flowers too, but we divided, it worked very logically and well, that the garden is basically in 4 rectangles and then behind that 2 squares. And the squares in the back are generally flowers and the rectangles are generally vegetables. Not always, I mean, there are flowers mixed in. But one thing I also learned that I really, and maybe that goes to your question about how to learn, I think it's super important, which is to start small. Because if you read writers, they'll tell you, oh, find what you love and plant, or just try it and see, or whatever, and be bold, that's another big one. And that's great, but it is a lot of work. And it was more work than I ever thought it would be. And so, just take something you can manage so you can enjoy it, and not something that's too big. And so, in fact, there's a bed across the back by the fence, and I'm just planting that with wild strawberries, so it sort of takes care of itself. I don't have to think about it, and honestly, there's less to think about.
Maybe someone on Zoom wants to know where your garden is located, and do you have a favorite vegetable to eat just as it's harvested?
Oh, that's a good question. It's located in what they call the very back country of Greenwich. So it is a quarter mile off the near quarter of Banksville. And so it's really quite countryside there. In fact, I wrote about a scary incident with or hearing these coyotes, but people kept warning us and saying, you're in the country. And I thought, we're 15 minutes from New York, how could we be in the country? But we are, I guess. And they were warning us about our small terrier, who's a very feisty little dog, but it's back there. So it's a good 20 minutes to get to the town of Greenwich. And my favorite vegetable, lettuce. Just lettuce is general. I love lettuce. I think it's so beautiful. Which kind I like most? I love gem lettuce, and I like balsam lettuce. But I just think they're so beautiful. And I really imagined when I was, quote unquote, dreaming about what the garden would be walking into lettuce. Cabbage though is another wonderful one. So beautiful, so big. And so we have a wonderful woman who's now retired, but she helped us cook, and she was very huge part of the family. And so she makes the most extraordinary coleslaw. And so I asked her again, but she doesn't quite feel. And so we finally got it on paper. It's not 100%, but that's the one recipe. And it's, of course, it uses the cabbages. Is there another question over there?
All right, thank you very much.
That's it. Thank you all.